In this lecture, I'd like to go over the Pythagorean theorem. The Pythagorean theorem describes the relationship between the three sides of a right triangle. So it's only used for right triangle. And you know it's going to be a right triangle when you see that little box in the right-hand corner. Anyway, so if we have a side that's A, another side that's B, and let's say our hypotenuse is called C, we can use the Pythagorean theorem, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared, to find the unknown side of a right triangle. We'll work through some examples. So in this example, I have a right triangle with one side that's 24, another side that's unknown, we're going to call it x, and our hypotenuse, the longest side, is going to be 30. To figure out the missing side x, we simply use the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. So in this case, 24 is going to be equal to a, x is going to be equal to b, and 30 is going to be equal to c. So let's plug and check. I have 24 squared, and I'm going to add that to our b squared, which is just going to be x squared, and this is going to equal our c squared, the hypotenuse, which is going to be 30. So I'm going to say this is 30 squared. So now we have to do is evaluate 24 squared, which is going to be 576. And then we're going to add this to x squared. And then we're going to say this equals 30 squared, which is 900. So now I have to solve for x squared. I do this by subtracting 576 from both sides. When I do that, this side goes to 0. I'm still left with x squared equals 900 minus 576, which is going to be 324. 324. I still have this x squared, so I have to take the square root of both sides. On this side, I'm just left with x, and it's going to be equal to the square root of 324, which is just going to be 18. So x equals 18. So in this example, we have 10 as one side, 24 on another, and then x is going to be our hypotenuse, which is directly across from the 90-degree angle. So all we have to do is use the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So our a in this example is going to be 10. So I'm going to say 10 squared, and then we are going to add that to our b, which is going to be 24. So this is going to be 24 squared. And this is going to be all equal to c squared. So c squared is going to be the hypotenuse. C is always the hypotenuse. So in this case, we're just going to call it x squared. And so now we have to evaluate 10 squared plus 24 squared. So we can start off by evaluating 10 squared. We know 10 times 10 is going to be 100. And we're going to add that to 24 squared, which is just 24 times 24. That calculates to 576. And this is going to equal our x squared. So now we have to add 100 to 576. Our grand total is going to be 676. And this is going to be equal to x squared. All we have to do now is get rid of the x squared. And we do that by taking the square root. So when we take the square root of x squared rather, it turns into x. And now we have to take the square root of 676. And that simplifies to 26, which is going to be equal to x. And therefore 26 will be our answer. Alrighty, in this example, we have a right triangle. We know it's a right triangle because of this box right here. And one side is 3, another side is 7, and our hypotenuse is going to be x, which is the longest side. So in order to figure out what x is, we have to use the Pythagorean theorem. The Pythagorean theorem is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So all we have to do is plug and chug. 3 is going to be a, 7 is going to be b, and x is going to be c. So now we say 3 squared plus our b squared, which is going to be, I heard it back there, it's going to be 7 squared, and this is going to be equal to x squared. So 3 squared is going to be 9, and we're going to add that to 7 squared, which is going to be 49, and this is going to be equal to x, whoops, meant to change color. It's going to be equal to x squared. So 9 plus 49 is just going to be 58. So I'm just going to say 58 is going to equal our x squared. So in order to get rid of the squared, we have to do the square root. So when I take the square root of x squared, it simply becomes x. And if I take the square root of one side, I have to take the square root to the other. So of course this is just going to be the square root of 58. And we can put that in decimal form by saying the square root of 58 is going to be 7.62. And that's going to be equal to our x. Alrighty, in this example, we have a right triangle with one side that's 6, a hypotenuse that's going to be 10, the longest side, and an unknown side that's going to be x. So in order to figure out the unknown side of x, we can use the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. A is going to be 6, c is going to be 10, the hypotenuse, and b is going to be x. So let's plug and chug. We're going to have a squared, which is going to be 6 squared, and we're going to add that to our b squared, which is just going to be x squared, and this is going to equal our c squared, which is going to be 10 squared. So now we have to evaluate the equation. 6 squared is going to be 36. And we're going to add that to our x squared. And we're going to say this is going to equal 10 squared, which is going to be, I thought I heard it back there, 100. All right, so now we have to get x all by itself. So that means we have to subtract 36 from both sides. 36 minus 36, this gives you 0. So we're just left with x squared on this side. And it's going to be equal to 100 minus 36, which is going to be 64. So now I take the square root on both sides, and I get x equals 8. So in this example, we have a right triangle. You know it's a right triangle because of this box in this corner. And one side is 8, another side is going to be x, and our hypotenuse, which is our longest side, is going to be 21. We know this is our hypotenuse because it's directly across from this 90-degree angle. All we have to do now is use the Pythagorean theorem. The Pythagorean theorem is going to be a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So in this case, our a is going to be 8, our b is going to be x, and our c is going to be 21. All we have to do is plug and chug, so let's do that. A squared is going to be equal to 8 squared, and we're going to add this to our b squared, which we said is equivalent to x. So we're just going to leave it as x squared. And we're going to say that's going to be equal to our c squared, which is 21. I'm going to call this 21 squared. Awesome, now we just have to evaluate these numbers. So 8 squared is going to be 64. And we're going to add that to our x squared. And this is going to be equal to 21 squared, which is 441. So I'm going to say 441. So now I just have to solve for x. In order to do that, I have to subtract 64 from both sides. When I subtract 64 from this side, it goes to 0. So I'm just left with x squared. It's going to be equal to 441 minus 64 is going to be 377. Now I have to get rid of the square. So I do that by taking the square root. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. It's going to leave me with x is equal to the square root of 377 is just going to be 19.42. In this example, we have a right triangle with one side that's 6, an unknown side that's x, and our hypotenuse, our longest side, which is 24. We want to find out the unknown side called x. So in order to do that, we can use our Pythagorean theorem, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So we can say that our a is going to be equal to 6, our b is going to be equal to x, and our c is going to be equal to 24. So let's just plug and chug. A squared is going to be 6 squared, and we're going to add that to our b squared, which is just going to be x squared, and this is going to be equal to our c squared, which is 24 squared. So now we have to do is evaluate the equation. 6 squared is going to be 36. And I'm going to say this is going to be added to x squared, and it's going to equal 24 squared, which is just going to be 576. So now, I have to get x all by itself. I do that by subtracting 36. So I'm going to minus 36. And if I minus 36 on one side, I have to minus 36 on the other. So let's do that. So this is just going to go to 0. Now I'm left with x squared. It's going to equal 576 minus 36 is going to be 540. Now I have x squared equals 540. So we're almost there. We're not quite done yet because remember, we have to solve for x. We have x squared. So in order to get rid of the squared, we have to do the square root. So we're going to take the square root on both sides. We take the square root of x squared, we just have x equals the square root of 540. It's just going to be 23.24.